I'm Kevin Shomper. Work for Nationwide Insurance down in the Columbus area. And just some contact information if you want to get hold of me. I also have information, some cards up here on the podium. And this just gives a little bit of background on me because it'll help to understand some of the things that I'll be talking about. But I've been in IT for 35-ish years now and everything like that. Done the picture done pretty well everything you can think of in IT. I mean, I've done operations and development and testing and project management and architecture and analysis and everything like that. As many folks do in IT, after a certain amount of time, transitioned over into management, and I'd spent 20 years in management in various roles and everything like that. But always, my picture here is the idea that I loved being close to the technology. And so rolled up sleeves, staying close to the developer, with I champion the idea of the developer in part because, that's where the work gets done. I mean, all the other roles are very important and they help feed into that idea of creation. But really as developers, where we wind up then creating or building that thing that, that is going to get used. That's the tangible asset that is produced out of all the intellectual thinking that goes into it. And so I was really glad when I was able to transition back. I spent about 9 years with the Air Force doing some systems acquisition and some research work. Whoops. Oh. So I threw this in here. 2 reasons. One, I just like Far Side cartoons. But the other reason is it helps me to also tell a story about some things that are relevant to this idea that we're talking about, the evolution of something. Something changing over time. And for that to happen, we need to be willing to adapt to change as well so that things can evolve. And in this first one here, this really did happen. Back when I was down at Eglin Air Force Base in the early 90s, and for those of you who were around at that time and able to watch the news, you had the first Gulf War that had started. And we were looking to drive a bomb nice and down and deep into the ground in order to blow up a bunker. And we just unfortunately didn't have any bombs with, shell casings that were sturdy enough to penetrate as deep as we needed to go. And so one of the teams, not ours, we were doing other research, but one of the teams was like, hey, if we do our normal processes and we have to go through an RFP and competitive bid and all the government contracting and everything like that, by the time we get one built, it's going to be 5-8 years or something like that. I mean, you'll have had two administrations and the presidency pass on by the time you get around to building this thing, and it's obviously not going to do you any good. And so we were down at Eglin Air Force Base, and that's home for Armament Systems Division, and so they were like, well, you know what we can do? We got all these old tanks out on the range that we've been blowing up for the last several years because that's what they did. They tested bombs down there that they dropped out of planes. And so they went out to the range and they cut the cannons off the tanks, brought them back into their offices. These are folks that work in program office, like IT, but engineers. And they made bombs in their offices, welded on some fins, threw a nose cone on it with a trigger and stuff like that. Actually mixed the explosives in the offices themselves, got it all packed in there real nice and everything like that, and shipped it off over to Iraq to get them dropped, and they got the job done. And they got that all done in about 90 days. And what it took was a change of mindset to say that the processes that we've been used to doing, we're not gonna do again. We're gonna change those things. So that's the first idea of evolution and change, is you got to be willing to adapt to processes. The second one is you got to stay curious. You got to be willing to learn. When I started in IT, and the very first programs I was writing was back in the middle to late 70s, technology, it just kept going on for a long period of time. And then it got shorter, and then it got shorter, and it got shorter, and it got shorter. And all wonderful things that we're learning this week and everything like that, and you're going to invest so much time and effort into and everything like that, are going to be obsolete in 3 to 5 years, if not before. And you're going to have to learn all sorts of new stuff all over again. Now, it's great. You can keep accruing that knowledge on top of the things, but we've got to be willing to learn, to evolve, to adapt, because if we don't, we're going to become obsolete. And so that's part of the reason also why I made the shift back into technology, was to be able to help to encourage with the idea of is we do need to evolve. And what's really important is the thing that we would look at today and say, hey, that's innovative, because we put our blood and our sweat and our tears and everything into something that we can't have such a heart attachment and ownership to it that we can't be willing to just go ahead and say, you know what, that was great back in the day, now I got to give it up. I carried around some code with me for a while and everything like that was really neat when I was doing some research and we were doing some simulation about planes flying around and figuring out who was killing who and everything like that so we could do it better. And it was really great C code. Now, lots of pointer arithmetic. Nobody would want to do that anymore again. I finally did get rid of it. It's not on my hard drive anymore. But, there was that attachment to it. So today here we're talking about the evolution of APIs. And so, just to get a start with some definitions here and everything like that. When I say API, lots of different things you can call an API. Library APIs, hardware APIs, and everything like that. Interface specifications or things like that. But this we're really talking about RESTful APIs, where I'm going to have a request-response pair, where I'm going to some, web black box out there, where I want to be able to accomplish something. Okay, and so. Just for those of you who, this may be new to you, let me flip on over. So here, we were doing some subversion to GitHub migration, and who wants to, go on to GitHub and do a whole lot of repetitive tasks manually? And it's not showing up there. Let me move the window. There we go. And so, basically that's your, what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to go ahead and send a post request to an address with some headers and then a data block. And that's what we mean by an API, is you really have a couple essential pieces of information that you're going to package up, ship off to something, and then you're going to get back the response. And so the idea of testing these things, if we want to do it in a manner that's not, automated, or if we want to do it in a manner that's automated, we got to be able to go ahead and just figure out what the essential parts are. So in the definition, we've got the URI, we've got some data that we're going to be sending it against, and we've got the resources. The resources really are those endpoints within the server base path combination that we want to hit and be able to ask them to do things. And I'm assuming, for the purpose of this conversation, that these things are defined by an OAS, and we'll talk about what an OAS here is in a second. But that's important. I have no idea where that came from. So we're working with an OAS, Open API specification. It defines those things, and we'll take a look at what that is. It's basically developer documentation. But the reason that I wanted to bring this up is because when you look at what we call the testable parts of the OAS spec, and hopefully you're familiar with these, you have your security portion, so you're going to be asking questions around, is this person authorized, and stop them if they are, or stop them if they're not allowed, let them in if they are allowed. You're going to be looking at different combinations potentially of how they're going to do that authorization, or whether they have an API key. In the paths section, depending on whether you have one or more resources, you're going to have to be looking at that and answering the question with regards to, well, have I tested all of the paths? And of course, again, you don't want to be doing this manually. And then lastly, when I get a path, I'm going to be sending in content to it. I'm either, putting payload into it through posts or puts or things like that, or I'm getting payload out of it through the gets or other activities. And so I want to make sure that, all of this stuff is being tested, and I want to be able to do it in an automated manner. And so, to give you a picture of that, basically, if this was your setup, I've got an application, I've got an API, I've got the client that's hitting the API and everything like that. We're going to be, taking our test client and putting that in place of the client so that we can go ahead and see if this thing is working the way we expect to. Now, at Nationwide, we've made the decision, okay, that in this section right here, you've got this server picture on the bottom here, and that's typical, in a simplistic model, that's what we're going to have. We've chosen to put an API gateway here, and so we've disconnected and have an API gateway as a proxy in front of the backend server provider. So for the purposes of definitions, we're calling the application, that's the provider. That's the person who's providing the resource, owns the or has the resource hosted and everything like that. You've got the API in the middle, and then the client on the other end. And in this case, we're going to be using our test client. And then going ahead and just validating that portion of the interface there. You're really not worried about what's happening back in the provider. You're just going to be looking at that API layer at that front end and saying, what is going in and out in accordance with the specification. And you'd say, well, how hard can that be? Well, obviously we saw all those different parts on the specification that we're going to have, and what I have up here is, the number of responses just in the response codes alone are 60 plus. Now, normally you're not going to have that many. You're going to have 6, 7, maybe 8. Depends on how well, particularly, not only success is usually 1 or 2, but then on the error side, you're going to have a richer set of things that potentially you might want to communicate back to your developer, the client developer, what's going on, because error messages do 2 things. They tell you what went wrong, right? They also, a good error message in today's expectation is what do you need to do go do it right? I don't know how many of you guys have been doing APIs against some things out there. I was doing some stuff with Git to help with just some conversions and things like that, and I really liked their messages that came back. When I would do something wrong, Git did a nice job of telling me, here's what you need to change in order to be able to make it work. And so between that and the documentation, it was not too hard to get to work. So let's take a look at just a quick in-depth look at an API. So I'm going to jump here and probably slide this guy over. I really need... That'll make it easier. Now I can see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull up an API idea, and this is just to give you a feel for, the complexity, and just to make sure that we've got So this is our nationwide developer portal, and on that portal, we're going to be able to describe what the API is, and so we've got 4 resources, 4 endpoints that you're going to be able to hit. To be able to say that, I want to be able to do some things with my commercial account on the billing space. If I click on one of these things, I can see here's what I would be expecting to be getting back. Here's my required parameters going in and everything like that. They're going in as either headers or query parameters or something like that. And then if something bad goes wrong, here's the potential error messages that I'm going to be getting back. And if I've got a post request where I'm required to provide a payload, then it's going to describe, well, here's my payload going in, and, what does it look like from a JSON schema perspective. And so, again, is just to give you the idea of the potential information that you may have within an API to be able to understand, well, if I want to test that this thing is working according to what this document says it's doing, there's a fair amount of work here to be able to validate that. Okay, and so it's just similar information. So often we're going to see multiple resources, lots of parameters, payloads, things like that, multiple potential response codes, and almost always payloads, particularly in the response body. And so this gets into the part then about the evolution, what we were doing from a testing perspective, and how we sort of first looked at it, and over time the sphere of our thinking evolved. How we thought, oh, this thing's bigger and bigger and bigger than what we might potentially want to do with it. And so at first, we had created this team where we're developing APIs on the gateway, and they're looking at it and they're saying, okay, I've got a back-end application, I've got my API defined in the middle, and I want to test this thing, and I've got a very particularly single API, test the resource kind of a view. Okay, so it's a fairly narrow view of what we're trying to accomplish. And it's just validating the API. And so, the initial design, had provided some information with regards to, what we would consider essential to be able to submit the request. And that is, I needed to have the type of test that I'm running. I have to be able to say, what HTTP verb am I using? What resource am I going after? The data that supports the request. And so that was just an easy way to be able to say if I had some headers that I needed to put in, if I had a payload that I had to supply, if I had query parameters or something like that. I didn't have to put all that in there. That generally was fairly static. And if it wasn't static, you could just have a different tag for those things. And then finally, what were my expected results? And so this worked pretty well. The get data, or I'm sorry, get request tag, basically said, here's my query string, some headers and things like that, content type and those things. Obviously, you don't see in there what the actual server host was, what the base path was. Those things were all wrapped up in this file called API config YAML. And what was interesting about that file is it not only contained, here's where I want to go from the endpoint that I'm interested in, but it also had all sorts of other information that one might need, such as, if I needed to authenticate, through OAuth, I'd have my authentication token in there. It would identify, who I was as a user and other information that might be necessary for the test environment. And all that was packaged together in a particular file, and then I had this set of tests that I was going to exercise against it. But again, the test types, that I could check my response keys, my headers, my substrings, things like that, and it worked real well. Okay, but there were a few limitations. Okay, part of the problem is that the output was coupled to the test type. So if I wanted to run a header test, I'd see headers, which is probably great if you're wanting to run a header test. But what if you wanted to see the body that was coming back as well? If I was running a response test, I'd see the body come back, I'd see the response, but then I couldn't do anything else with it besides just validating. So the limitation was fairly strong. There was also some extra stuff you had to put in there around areas where if I needed to say what particular header I wanted to validate, because I couldn't just say, well, here's the data I want, because I might want that data on a particular space. And if I wanted to test multiple things that were coming back, and you can see some of those responses could be fairly complex. If I wanted to test several things on that, I would have to make the call several times. And as you're all well aware, REST calls, gets, that's easy to do. Gets are going to be idempotent. They're going to get back the same thing every time that you make the call. But other types of calls, particularly posts or other things, may not yield always the same results. And so if you have to inspect many things and you have to call it several times to inspect it several times, that could potentially be problematic. And then also just, for ease of operation, this was built in Ruby, so very early on, the string that we have there, it kind of looks like almost like a JSON object, but it's a Ruby hash. And it was just on a single line. It was not even being read as a Ruby hash. It was being read as a text line and then evaluated. And so just from an extensibility standpoint, we're going to run into some trouble there as well, because as I added more and more features to that, you can just see this line is just going to get longer and longer and longer, and eventually it becomes hard to manage. And so, sort of the next iteration of this thing said, okay, so we've done our development. I'm looking at this thing. I can kind of be an API developer and make sure that the API I'm working on in the gateway is doing what I expect it to do. But now I want to take a little bit further. We've got a number of these things now that we've developed, and we've got some best practices developed, and we want to make sure that those best practices are present in future work that we do, because you don't want to have to keep repeating that stuff. And so you'd love to be able to script it all up and say, did whatever standards we're going to set, are they present? I mean, that's part of your CI, is to be able to enforce standards. And so we were able to take this and not only execute it locally, but then you're executing it in Jenkins as well. And in the second design, as you're now growing this thing out, I want to be able to chain requests together. And so I may want to take the results of one and put it into another one. And so added additional test methods, response capture, custom capture, and also we want to do some of the negative testing. And so added, the ability to say, well, if this test type is, an API key or an OAuth test, well, it's going to strip off the things that were necessary to make that successful so that it would prove that it wasn't successful, because it shouldn't be without those. And so it just added this additional capability in the second design to be able to now test a chain. Also added things called user realms. And so within Nationwide, and other businesses as well, you're going to have different roles that people are going to play, and that's going to give them different potential accesses depending on who they are, and also part of this is how they're authenticated. Okay, because it's not just their authorization, but who they are as well, and so the different realms would identify what directory you're going to go look at. So the different realms of associate member, the unidentified person who has rights to come in and do something because they've started activity with you, they've created a business relationship, but they don't actually have a user ID on your system. And again, we still had some limitations. In the second iteration, we still had only one value that was captured with each call, and the negative tests, API key, OAuth, etc. They only validated the response code. So if you wanted to look at the response message that came back and said, was that according to the spec, or you wanted to understand a little bit more with regards to whether or not it was matching, that you couldn't answer that question. And then also the user and the API configuration, that packaged up set of stuff that said, well, what host am I going to, and what user am I, was also all in wrapped up within one file. So if I wanted to run a test and say I want to exercise this API and I want to exercise it in my CI or for a regression activity, and I want to try all the realms, well, I couldn't, not easily, because that one named file was only had a slot for one name, not three, or whatever was required. And so then we went ahead and continued to expand our view and everything like that. We said, okay, so we now want to go ahead and test these things. We want to test them in CI. And sometimes we got into the area where we were doing some parallel development. So the back end didn't even exist yet, or the back end was also under change while you're building out your API. So I designed my API and I say, this is what I want it to be, right? And you do that hopefully from an outside-in view to be able to say, because the idea is it's for an external customer. Sometimes it's for your team internally, but often it's for the outside folks. And so you don't want to have all of the stuff about your asset showing up in the API, because it ought to speak to the business domain, not to how you've implemented the business domain inside your organization. But so we defined the OAS, and we're starting to build that, but the back end it's changing, or maybe it's new or something like that. And so what I've sort of grayed out there is this idea that I want to be able to run my test, and I want the proxy to potentially hit a mock server or to provide some mock response. I might want to stub some things out. And so how do I do that and control it in a way so that I can run it, for real when the back end's there and it's real, or I can run it to exercise the code that I'm developing, without necessarily being dependent on the code that somebody else is developing. Additionally, you don't want to be, if the goal of your API CI is to be able to say, is my API good? Is the code that I just pushed to the repo, is it good? Well, I may want to run that without necessarily worrying about whether the backend's there or not, because otherwise I'm going to get false errors against not my code, but somebody else's code. So that's always a challenge, when you're doing testing and everything like that, is the isolation to be able to say I know exactly what's under test, and I'm seeking to test only that thing, and not, have the results muddied by other stuff that I'm not responsible for. And so that was also worked to be able to then say, okay, well now my test tool can communicate with this with these proxies and be able to exercise them either with an end-to-end, because sometimes you want to do that. I want to do a regression test, or I want to verify that from start to finish everything is looking good. The other thing that it needed to do was I want to be able to now hit possibly more than one API. We had situations where I'm going to call out to something, and that's now my business threads are getting broader, and I may have to cross a base path specification in order to be able to accomplish something. And so I need to be able to handle more than one base path, and so that's what that is there. So the other thing we did is we as we've talked about, it said it was a limitation separating out the call from the test. And so that was done, modified in it, and that allowed us to do some things. So as I showed you and pull it up here, there. Yeah, so this is what the tests look like, and I'm going to have to go back to. And if I was a professional presenter, I'd know how to do this better. Early on, so these would have been the tests. You're basically looking at a text file and everything like that. And so now we went over to something that was a little bit more easier to read, definitely more extensible than what we had before. And so now I've got a series of scenarios, and this was done up in YAML because you didn't have all the syntactic sugar that you'd have with JSON, so it was easier to read. And so now I've still got my mandatory pieces of information, where I define what my method is, my resource, my data, use the same form that we were using before. But now I can have one or more tests that I'm going to exercise against these things, so I can look at the what the value is, whether I can find a piece of data in there. This one here. You could say, well, I want to go ahead and give a test a number. You don't have to, but you can give a test a number, and that allowed you to reference it later on and say, well, this test here, or this invocation, this call, depends on this one that comes before it. So if this one fails, don't exercise this one. That way, I'm not getting false positives in my test set and everything like that. And using relational referencing as well. Doesn't care, you can go one way or the other. So I can explicitly call out something if I want to give it a number, or I can say, that test that was run 2 tests before or something like that. If that one fails, then don't run this one here. So now you're going to get more capability in the system to be able to say I can handle a variety of conditions that may occur as I'm exercising through the tests. And so we'll flip back. And then we enhanced for the stubbing and the mocking support and everything like that to be able to then send, control switches into the thing to be able to say, hey, either run this with or without the mocking. And then also, we've modeled but haven't developed yet, so this is still a work in progress. The ability to support, the multiple base paths and the adjustment to the configuration files. And so let me just go back to this. The last picture here we have here is this idea of, well, how could you use this thing even more? And so, we talked about this, kind of whiteboarded it up. Haven't done all of it yet, although when I get back next week, we'll have a conversation with our monitoring team and say, well, we can now script the exercising of these things and everything like that. We haven't really done a great job necessarily of having a consistent way to do this in production. So what could we do to be able to then take all the same things that we've done over in our CI environment, without the build portion of it, and then take those and exercise a regular touch of the APIs over in the production space. And so what can I do from a monitoring perspective so that I can test and make sure these things are there? Looking at it, again, the focus of the team was those who were developing. And sometimes when we develop, we say, well, what I really care about is the code that I'm working on today. If you take another perspective for a different group of folks over either in the operational space or the people that own, more of a broader stack of assets or something like that, they're less concerned about what's getting developed today, and they're all worried about what got developed and is being used by customers. And so their view is going to be one where I want to be able to check and say, well, what's my application suite health? Is that in good order? And it's not just a monitoring question, but if I want to be able to exercise something in break fix, or I want to be able to just understand that, I'd like to be able to run these things as well. Optionally, and I don't know if a client would do this, I'm a client developer, I'm exercising things, and I have a question with regards to how it works. One of the easiest ways that I've seen to know whether something's working or not is go watch a demo. Exercise something that I know does work, and then I can try to figure out the difference between what does and what mine is doing, and then I can understand what's going wrong. And so a client, application developer, internal in this case here, would be helped by saying, well, I can go ahead and exercise this tool or something like that. And so I'm going to head back next week. We're going to talk about, what can we do in a production sense in the monitoring space. Is there something we can take in here and be able to extend that over into we use New Relic as a tool. And so, that's going to be part of the conversation. So again, going out even broader yet to ask self questions. How do we take a tool that we've built and be able to exercise it to a greater degree? And so that just really reflects what I had there before. The question mark on the bottom. And as I was going through this presentation, and you put the abstract together back in the summer, and here it is 5 months later, and we're giving the talk. And in the course of going through and building the presentation and really anticipating the questions that some of you might ask, our team, started with this tool, and this goes back to what I had started with earlier, is the ability to let go. We put some effort into this thing, and it's working great, and it's supporting our integration pipeline and all of those things. But somebody might have said, well, why didn't you use this, or why didn't you use that? And when we first asked that question, a choice may not have been available, or it may not have fit, or it may not have had everything that you wanted to have in it. And as I was continuing to look at this, we may shift and go a different way. I was looking at some things that Postman has added to it, and a lot of folks were using Postman, and they were doing it for the sort of manual activity, but not necessarily for the automated activity. But there's some new opportunities there that weren't necessarily there before, and the ability to do some automation. And so we'll probably take a look at that. And so we've always got to be willing to sort of learn from what we've done. Everything's relevant because we gain knowledge from it, but we've got to make sure we're not too closely tied to it. Because when we are, then what winds up happening is we're tomorrow's developers, that are stuck on their technology, that somebody's working real hard to kind of push over into something new, because we've invested so much time in it and find it hard to make that move. And so that's just really the idea there is just we've got to always be looking and saying, how do we get value out of what we've done, and then how do we have that willingness to move on. And so with that, I kind of went through a little quicker than I had expected to. Hopefully you all don't mind. They did say they wanted you to make sure that you felt like you got value for the sessions. Please remember the session survey. Take a few minutes. If you don't take care of it now, take care of it whenever you get a chance to find a few minutes. Any questions that you might have for me? Yes, sir.